They said the bells of San Erasmo rang too long that morning. The sound drifted through the olive groves, soft at first, then swelling like a warning that no one wanted to hear. In the village square, people gathered in their Sunday clothes, whispering behind fans and folded hats. They came to witness what the priest himself called an impossible ceremony. Two sisters, Isidora and Camila Calderón, walking side by side toward the altar, their lace veils brushing against each other like mirrors of the same soul. And waiting for them was one man, Don Mateo Valera, the landowner who had promised his heart to one but could not let go of the other. When the church doors closed, the crowd fell silent. They said even the candles seemed to bend toward the aisle, as if curious to see what love looked like when it defied God. The priest hesitated before speaking the vows. His voice trembled when he read the line that joined not two but three. In his record book, he wrote the union as irregular but sanctified under necessity. What that necessity was, no one dared ask aloud. Some said the sisters had fallen to their knees the night before, praying to the Virgin of Shadows, a saint no church ever named, but whose statue stood hidden in the Calderón attic, veiled in black silk, eyes painted open. The wedding photograph was taken just before dusk, when the light had turned the village gold. It shows the sisters smiling faintly, their hands clasped together, the groom between them like a bridge made of flesh. Yet when the plate was developed, the photographer noticed something wrong. Isidora's reflection was sharp, her eyes clear, Mateo's too, but Camila's face, her reflection seemed to tilt away, blurred as if caught in motion, even though she hadn't moved. The man destroyed the original glass, but copies remain. Some say if you stare too long, you can see her lips forming words, whispering to her sister. After that day, San Erasmo changed. The harvest soured, olive oil turned bitter in the press, and at night, from the hills villagers heard the echo of two voices singing the same hymn, one always half a breath behind the other. When the priest was asked years later what he remembered of the ceremony, he said only this: it felt like watching a promise made to something that wasn't human. He burned his robe the next morning and left the parish before sunrise. The Calderón sisters moved into the Valera estate soon after, and no one saw them together again in public. But sometimes, passing by the fields at night, workers claimed to see a lantern swinging in the distance, two shadows moving as one. The villagers said it was a love blessed by darkness, a union the light could never truly touch, and that was where it began, not with violence, but with devotion twisted just enough to become something else entirely, something that still remembers the vows whispered beneath the Virgin's blind gaze. They called it La Casa de las Dos Lunas, the House of Two Moons, because at night its windows glowed with a strange divided light, one warm, one cold, like two faces watching from the same skull. The Valera estate sat on the edge of the olive fields, far enough from the village that the wind carried only whispers of what went on inside. Isidora and Camila lived there as wives, not rivals. They cooked together, prayed together, even dressed alike. Only their eyes were different. Isidora's steady and full of faith, Camila's soft and distant, as if she was listening to something the rest could not hear. The villagers said they saw Mateo less and less. Some claimed he slept in a separate room. Others said he no longer spoke at all. But what everyone agreed on was the sound that drifted from the estate each night, a lullaby sung in two voices, weaving through the olive trees. It was always the same tune, slow and mournful, and always in a minor key. Children woke crying from nightmares they could never describe, and dogs refused to go near the fence. When people asked what the song meant, an old servant whispered that it wasn't meant for the living. It was meant to calm something that had been born wrong. By 1905, 6 children lived in the house. They were pale as milk, quiet as sleepwalkers, and each one looked eerily like the next. Their faces were perfectly symmetrical, their movements perfectly mirrored. When one turned his head, another followed. When one smiled, the others smiled too. A visiting physician, curious about the rumors, arrived from Seville to examine them. He took measurements, made sketches, and wrote one final note in his journal before disappearing. Identical features across distinct births, impossible unless inheritance itself has collapsed. The villagers searched for him for days. His horse was found wandering the fields, its reins torn, its eyes white with fear. After that, the family withdrew entirely. Curtains stayed drawn, and the lullaby stopped. Years passed. The estate fell into ruin, the fields swallowed by weeds. But when workers finally returned decades later to clear the land, they found something under the nursery floor, a buried crib, carved from olive wood and lined with silk. Inside were dozens of tiny teeth, polished smooth as pearls. No bones, no names, just the teeth, arranged in a circle as if to mark the mouths that once sang. The villagers still say that on certain nights, when the moon splits the sky in two, you can hear the lullaby again. Two voices, tender and off-key, rocking the ghosts of their own children to sleep. And in the distance, the House of Two Moons still glows faintly, waiting for someone to listen. In the spring of 1911, a young pathologist from Madrid, named Dr. Esteban Rios, arrived in San Erasmo, under the guise of studying regional health records. In truth, he had come for the journals of a physician who had vanished years before, the man who once examined the Calderón children. The journals were delivered to him by a dying archivist, pages brittle with age and stained with something dark. Inside, the doctor found sketches of identical faces, looping handwriting that repeated one phrase over and over: children without difference, one soul divided. It was enough to draw him south, to the edge of the olive fields where the house still stood, hollow and quiet beneath two moons. Locals warned him not to stay long. They said the land remembered every step taken upon it, that it fed on those who tried to understand it. But Esteban was a man of logic. He believed in bloodlines and chromosomes, not curses. He took rooms above the old apothecary and began interviewing the few villagers who still recalled the Valera estate. Each account was the same: two women, one husband, and children who seemed to share more than blood. He wrote that the villagers spoke with fear but also longing, as if part of them missed the presence that once sang through their nights. Weeks later, the doctor's assistant in Madrid received a telegram. It read, "They are breeding memory itself." Nothing more. Then silence. Esteban Rios was never seen again. His belongings were recovered from the apothecary, his notebooks open to an unfinished line. The womb remembers what the mind cannot. The authorities dismissed his disappearance as misadventure, perhaps a fall in the nearby ravine. But the villagers whispered that they had seen him walking toward the vineyards at dusk, following a sound that only he could hear. Half a century passed before anyone disturbed that ground again. During a renovation of the old Valera property, workers uncovered a dry well hidden beneath a layer of stone. Inside lay a single skeleton, its arms twisted as if bracing for a fall. Around its neck hung a rusted medical tag, engraved with the initials ER. Forensics confirmed it was Esteban Rios. But the tests that followed defied everything the scientists knew. His remains carried two distinct mitochondrial lines, both tracing back to the Calderón sisters. Two mothers, one body. The report was sealed. The bones were reburied quietly under government order. But among the villagers, the old story returned to life, that the land of San Erasmo does not let go of those who try to separate its blood from its memory. And on certain nights, they say, you can still hear a man's voice beneath the olive trees, reciting his notes to someone who never answers. By the 1940s, the Calderón name had become little more than a whisper in San Erasmo, a story told to frighten children and amuse travelers. People said the bloodline had ended long ago, buried beneath the olive fields where the house once stood. But the records told a different story. Census lists showed families with new names: Valera, Lunas, Estero, all living in the same valley, all tied to the same patch of land. The handwriting on the documents was identical across generations, as though one person had filled them out for decades. And none of them, not a single soul, had ever left the village. When outsiders came asking questions, the villagers smiled politely and shut their doors. But sometimes at dusk, children could be heard calling to someone they called Mama Isa and Mama Mila. They spoke the names like they belonged to bedtime stories, gentle, affectionate, alive. One journalist from Madrid visited in the 1960s to write about the legend. He described faces that looked eerily familiar, neighbors who seemed like reflections of each other, eyes matching eyes, mouths curved in the same half-smile. In a farmhouse attic, he found a stack of portraits wrapped in cloth. Every photograph showed a family gathered around the same cradle. The faces changed clothes and hair but not shape. The cradle, he wrote, appeared to outlive the children. He never finished his article. His notes ended with one line: "They do not age, they just repeat." He left the village the next morning, pale and trembling. When asked later why he had gone, he said only that he'd dreamt of two women standing over him, humming a lullaby in unison. The house stood until 1971, its windows long shattered, its roof sagging like a tired lung. That spring, a storm rolled in from the coast and struck the valley with thunder that split the hills. The next morning, the estate was gone, collapsed into itself. Villagers who ran to the site claimed to hear something beneath the rubble. Not screams, not panic, but the sound of voices, low, soft and relieved. It sounded, they said, like people recognizing each other after a long separation, like family finally together again. When the rain stopped and the ground settled, no remains were found, only fragments of glass, a few scraps of lace, and one photograph frame half buried in the mud. Inside was a faded image of two women standing side by side, their hands entwined, their smiles faint but certain. At the bottom of the frame, two signatures pressed into the paper in identical ink: Isidora and Camila. They were gone, the villagers said, but not dead. Families still born on that land carried their eyes, their voices, their silence. It was as if the Calderón sisters had never left at all, only learned how to keep living through the ones who came after. In 1998, in a quiet corner of the Seville Provincial Archives, a historian named Lucia Correa came across a small metal tin buried beneath stacks of forgotten property files. Inside was a roll of undeveloped film, brittle with age, labeled only Valera Estate, 1906. The handwriting was faded, but she recognized the surname immediately. The Calderón case had haunted her studies for years, a legend dismissed as hysteria, yet always resisting closure. She took the film home, eager to uncover what the lens might have seen before the house fell to ruin. When the negatives developed under the soft red glow of her lab, the images appeared like whispers returning to light. The first few were ordinary: rooms in disrepair, furniture covered in dust sheets, the exterior of a house heavy with ivy. But the last frame was different. Taken from outside the nursery window, it showed 6 children standing in a perfect line beside 2 women. Each child was identical, their faces pale and still, their eyes slightly turned toward the lens, as if aware of being watched. One woman smiled faintly, her expression almost serene. The other wept, her tears frozen mid-fall. Lucia leaned closer, trying to make sense of it. That's when she noticed the shadow. Stretching across the back wall behind them was the figure of a man, tall, unmistakable, with one hand resting on the weeping woman's shoulder. The official records were clear. Mateo Valera had been dead for over a decade when the photograph was taken. She checked for signs of double exposure, light leaks or damage to the film. There were none. The image was clean, too clean. For days, Lucia pored over the negatives, convinced there was more hidden in the grain. Under magnification, she saw something she couldn't explain. The children's pupils reflected the same room she stood in. Her lamp, her desk, her own silhouette leaning forward. She wrote one final note in her research journal. There is still movement in their eyes. That was the last entry she ever made. When colleagues tried to contact her weeks later, her apartment was found empty, the lights still on, the darkroom door sealed from the inside. Only the faint smell of chemicals lingered in the air. The negatives were gone, along with every copy of her notes. In the years since, archivists have dismissed her disappearance as unrelated, just another missing person in a city that forgets quickly. But every so often, an assistant sorting old film reels reports hearing a faint clicking noise, like a shutter firing by itself. And when they open the drawer marked Valera, the same rumor passes quietly from one archivist to the next. There's a photograph in there that no one took, and sometimes the children in it are no longer standing still. In 2013, a construction crew digging foundations near the outskirts of San Erasmo unearthed something the soil had been hiding for more than a century. Beneath layers of clay and shattered tile, they found fragments of bone, small and delicate, mixed with shards of old glass and rusted silver. The site was identified as part of the old Valera estate, the same land once called La Casa de las Dos Lunas. The discovery should have been just another archaeological note in the town's long, decaying history. But what came next reopened a story that science had tried and failed to forget. Forensics teams catalogued the remains with clinical precision, unaware of the name that slept beneath them. Samples were sent to Madrid for genetic testing. When the results returned, the analysts thought their equipment had malfunctioned. The DNA contained no traceable lineage. Instead, it formed looping structures, mitochondrial sequences replicating themselves endlessly, without origin or parent. It was as if the cells were feeding on memory, duplicating patterns with no beginning and no end. A senior geneticist described it as a code folding in on itself, something that shouldn't exist in any living organism. The findings were quietly reclassified under genetic anomalies, sealed away from public access. But rumors spread through academic circles. The bones carried two distinct mitochondrial signatures, one belonging to Isidora Calderón, the other to her sister Camila. Somehow, the two had merged into a single living sequence. Scientists dismissed it as contamination. The church, however, called it evidence of corruption, a sin that outlived its sinners. Then came the final anomaly. While processing civilian data for a national genealogy registry, a technician flagged a match to the Calderón samples. The woman, a 27-year-old living in Seville, had submitted her DNA through a consumer ancestry service. Her results were impossible. A perfect 100% mitochondrial correlation with both sisters. She was contacted for verification, but her responses grew strange. First eager, then fearful, then silent. Her last email to the department read, "They never stopped choosing him. Now they've chosen me." Investigators went to her apartment. 3 days later, the door was unlocked. The lights were on. Her phone sat on the kitchen counter, screen still glowing with the open genealogy page. The coffee on the table was cold. Her diary lay beside it, the final page smeared with ink, but legible enough to read one line. "They hum in my blood when the moon divides." She was never found. The authorities closed the case under missing persons, but inside the forensics lab, her samples were preserved. Even now, under magnification, her cells still move, not dividing, breathing. The sequence continues to copy itself, weaving the names Isidora and Camila into every new strand. It is as if the blood refuses extinction, rewriting the living until it becomes its own reflection. And somewhere between science and superstition, one truth lingers like a warning. The Calderón line was never meant to end. It simply learned how to begin again. Today, the Calderón case sits in the corner of forgotten archives, labeled as folklore, a rural myth dismissed by scientists and priests alike. The official reports call it a historical fabrication, a mix of superstition and genetic misinterpretation. But there are details that refuse to stay buried. The missing files, the vanished researchers, the anomalies that no laboratory could replicate. Every attempt to close the case only seems to wake it again, as though the story itself is alive, rewriting those who dare to read it. In San Erasmo, people still speak the sisters' names, though never after dark. They say that on nights when the moon hides and the air turns still, two women walk the border of the olive fields, their faces identical, their hands clasped like a single body divided by will alone. Their dresses are old, their hair veiled in black, and wherever they step the sound of soil shifting follows, like something beneath the earth recognizing its own. Those who've seen them say they never speak, yet the air hums with a sound that feels like voices. Two lullabies, overlapping, falling out of rhythm, and then back again, like two hearts trying to beat the same memory. Last year, a group of paranormal investigators sent drones over the remains of the Valera estate. The footage showed the ruins bathed in mist, the olive trees moving though no wind was present. Then the thermal cameras caught something impossible. Two heat signatures standing side by side, inside the foundation's outline, perfectly still, pulsing in sync. When one shape flickered, the other did too, as if they shared the same heartbeat. The footage was confiscated within days, and the team disbanded soon after. One member, in an interview that never aired, said quietly, "It felt like they knew we were watching." For the villagers, it isn't evidence they need. It's presence. They still find the lullabies recorded faintly on wind monitors, caught between frequencies too low for human ears. They still see the marks in the soil, two sets of footprints appearing after rain, leading nowhere. Some say the sisters never wanted worship or pity, only remembrance, that their curse was not in their love, but in their refusal to let their blood forget itself. Because memory, they say, is alive. It moves through the body like breath through lungs. It waits for names to be spoken again. And somewhere beneath those olive trees, beneath the stones that once framed their home, the blood still stirs, slow, patient, endless. It remembers the hands that shaped it, the vows that bound it, and the song that still hums when the night grows too quiet. The Calderón sisters are gone, yes, but their memory was never meant to rest. It was meant to return.